Okay, welcome back. We're going to continue with the topic of human population with the second set of slides that really a second part of the lecture that goes with some of the readings that you did for today. And this really is going to zoom into the concept that is related to the discussion forum post about the relationship between human population growth and human well-being, in particular economics, right? So we're going to be looking here at the relationship between human population growth and economic well-being. Okay, so I have these questions here. And I want you to take some time, maybe pause the video and answer these for yourself. Again, all of these are things that, some of these things that I suggest in the video that aren't posted in a separate link where you have to upload something. No, you're not going to get a grade for this. However, the material's going so fast in this course, and you're going to have a quiz shortly on this. And so these are things that I'm providing that should you want to take the initiative and really better understand the material, this would be a good thing to do. So, take a moment. If hopefully, again, you've done the readings before you watch this video, and you should, if you understood those readings, you should be able to answer these two questions. So take a moment and try to write out a comprehensive, pretend this is a short answer on a quiz or a test, write out a comprehensive answer to that before you watch the rest of this video, because I'm about to answer those questions for you. Okay, so demographic transition. Demographic transition theory is a theory in demography. So let's back up and what's a theory? Typically a theory, although not always, and I'm going to show you some theories in this class that don't always have a great amount of data behind them, but typically a theory in science should have a lot of data behind it, and it's generally well accepted by the population. So we've seen lots of examples of this. It doesn't mean that we also always know the right reason behind it, but at least we have some good evidence to show that this is a trend of relationship. So the demographic transition, the idea is that there is this relationship between economic growth and development, right? So this idea of the economic development as measured by GDP in a country and population size. And the theory, which does make a bit of sense, is that when you have let's say a nation that does not have a very high level of economic growth and development, so they don't have a lot of medical care, they don't have a lot of infrastructure, they're going to have a higher death rate. And also typically you're going to have a higher birth rate. Access to things like birth control is one thing that's going to impact birth rate. Another huge thing that's going to impact birth rate is actually the education of the childbearing population, or females. And so in this, I gotta get out my little laser pointer. So in this early, well, not really early, when a nation is less developed, you're often going to have a higher birth rate, but also a higher death rate among the population. Now what happens, and again, we can't really think of many nations that would fit this sort of phase one description today. Because of globalization, most countries have been exposed to modern medical care. The concept of education is more pervasive across many different populations. And so often nations are going to be more in these regions today. Okay, so what is the idea, again, of what happens? The idea is that with increased access to medical care, you're going to see a drop in the death rate. And this drop in the death rate is going to happen before a drop in the birth rate, right? So there's going to be a time lag there that people are used to reproducing a lot, and the death rate falls off, but people are still having a lot of babies. When you look at this big difference between your birth rate and the death rate, that's when the population is going to be growing the most, right? So if you're looking at all the different aspects of this graph right here, this is the y-axis. We're looking at birth and death rates per 1,000 people. And then in theory, this isn't a very well labeled graph, but in theory, you should have another labeled axis over on this second y-axis that would probably say something about population size. But this is just a hypothetical graph, so it's not very exact. But when birth rate and death rate are high, you're going to have a low population size that's not growing. When there's this big difference between birth rate and death rate, you're going to have a quickly growing population. And then finally, what's going to happen, you're going to start to see a decrease in the birth rate and a leveling off where birth and death rate are about the same, right? Potentially, eventually dipping, the birth rate dipping below the death rate and actually seeing a decline in the population, which is one of the things that we're seeing in some countries in the world today. Okay, so the idea with these 4 phases of the demographic transition, this phase 1 being kind of a, and I don't particularly like this, it makes it sound as though all nations are on this sort of trajectory of development, but this is a very Western idea and a way that a lot of Western countries talk about development. But that you have these kind of undeveloped countries that are going to be in this phase 1, and then as you're developing, right, a developing country is going to be kind of in phase 2, and then in phase 3, you're getting your more developed countries. And then finally in phase 4, you have potentially a highly educated female population that's delaying the beginning of reproductive years. And that's going to ultimately level off the population. So why does this theory matter? Because on some level, implicitly, it's saying that economic development is good for decreasing population growth. And we have seen, if you look across some of those charts that I showed you in the last lecture, so the last lecture slides, if you look at those, you will notice that some of the, quote, more developed countries do have lower population growth rates, right? And so there does seem to be some evidence for this across the world. However, in our lab, we're going to talk about this relationship between economic development and ecological impact. And you're going to learn that it's not so simple as economic development, therefore, is good for the environment. Okay, so that's something I want you to keep in mind, particularly as you move on to the readings about material consumption. Spoiler alert, that people who have more wealth tend to have a greater ecological footprint and a basically more damaging role on the environment. So ultimately, it's probably not the case that economic development is particularly good for the environment. As people, one of the huge challenges of sustainability science is trying to figure out how to increase well-being of people on the planet while decreasing our ecological footprint. But that's really the topic for tomorrow. So, okay, so some ideas here again. What factors drive the transition? What evidence do demographers use to support these theory, right? Hopefully that was clear in the last slide. The factors driving this transition, we're talking about economic growth and things like access to medical care, access to education, and then the evidence that demographers are using is from trends they've been able to chart in existing countries. This last question 3 we just talked about on the last page. Okay, so age structure diagrams. These are important to be able to read. They give you some good information about general trends in populations across the world and across countries. So what you're seeing here, on the x-axis, you're seeing percent, right? So this is percentage of the population. And then you have kind of a right and a left side to coincide with the male and the female population. And then on the y-axis, you have these age brackets. So the idea being that of this world population, approximately 5% of that population are males that are between the age of 0 and 4. about 5% are females, also between the age of 0 and 4, right? If you go to the top of the diagram, you can see that about 2, 4, 6, 8, yeah, so about 2% are males between the age of 65 and 69, and about 2% are females between, 65 and 69. So these are the general trends of the age structure across the world. When you look at this, what you should know is that this is a slightly increasing population, right? Because you have more people at the bottom of this diagram than at the top, which means that the population is bigger here than it is at the older population. Okay, so if you look at these three graphs, you can see a dramatic difference between an rapidly growing population. Okay, so here you have 20% of the population being females between, presumably this is again age 0 to 5 or something of the sort. Here in a stable population, we see that essentially you have an equal distribution across the main age cohorts with a slight decline as you get older. And then here would be a declining population. So we see this, this kind of, you can imagine this graph over here, right? If you kind of cut it off there, that's what we're seeing up here, right? So there was a fast growing population, but then it actually started to decline, right? So we have this bulge of population growth, but that's going up, and then it's beginning to decline. Okay, so if we were in a classroom, I'd ask you this question: what country do you think this is? And the reason I ask this question is for you to be able to think through, what do you know about the demographic transition theory? What do you know about these different countries? And how might that relate to the changing population? So this is, and I should, heads up, these are a little outdated. These are about 10 years old. But this is the US population from about 10 years ago. All right, what about this one? India. So what we see here is, hopefully you're seeing a quickly increasing population. And note here, something I want to point out, that this x-axis is not a percentage anymore. So if you're like, well, how do we have 60% between 0 and 5 and another 60% between 5 and 10? Well, that's because these are actually population size now in millions. But the same, you read it generally similarly, and the same overall trends and conclusions are going to be the same. All right, this country. So this is China. And one of the things that sometimes students are able to identify in this graph is that there's sort of a sudden and abrupt switch from a rapidly growing to a decreasing population. And anyone who knows something about the history of China knows that they've put a lot of measures in place to try to limit the growth of their population. Okay, so moving on, now that I hope you know how to read those diagrams, this one gets a little bit more complicated. So this was in one of your readings. And what you need to imagine is, if you kind of turned this 90 degrees to the left, you can imagine that you're looking at sort of a slice of that age structure diagram, where you have now on the x-axis these different age groups. In the overall population, there's no male and female anymore. They're just showing you the total population on the y-axis. And what they've done is they've taken each of those age structure diagrams and they've stacked them in a three-dimensional way along a third axis that's showing you the years, okay? So what are you seeing here? You're seeing that in sub-Saharan Africa, you've actually got a continually increasing population up through the present and predicted into the future, right? Where you're always going to have more and more births because as this population ages, they're having babies, and then these ones are having babies. And so you get this exponential growth rate into the future. Meanwhile, in Southeast Asia, you're seeing that you had an exponential growth in population, but that actually started to decline. And so if that trend continues into the future, what you're going to see is this spike, right? This bulge that we saw in this one of China, right? That bulge is going to continue to move across the age groups. So they're going to be eventually older with a lower population that is being born, right? Kind of akin to the baby boomer population in the United States, except we've of course never had a declining population. So it wouldn't be the same kind of bulge, but it was this one generation that got quite big quite quickly. Okay, so back to those questions that I asked in the beginning about the readings. So there was this idea in the reading of a demographic dividend. Do not confuse this with the demographic transition theory, right? I explained what that was in the beginning. The demographic dividend is a different concept. And to back up, well, rather, spoiler alert forward, that sometimes economists believe that there's a problem associated with a declining population. And the idea is that if a population is getting older, you will have fewer people in a working age group able to support the older aging population. So the whole point of the article about the demographic dividend was using data to provide a counter argument to that concern. Okay, so the idea of the demographic dividend, if you just kind of search through the article and you found the word demographic dividend, you might have come up with this quote. The demographic dividend is a composite of accounting and behavioral forces that are key to the accumulation of physical and human capital and technological innovation. Okay, if you put this on a quiz, first of all, that would be considered plagiarism and would get you an academic integrity violation, but it also would get you 0 points because that answer tells me nothing. It doesn't tell me that you understood it. And actually, if you pick it apart, it really doesn't tell, it's a completely empty statement. All right, it basically says it's a thing that is important. So let's pick apart what a demographic dividend is. And to really get into it, you have to understand this figure. And this figure is quite complicated. So let's walk through it. We've got 3 different axes. We have our x-axis here, which is showing us the years, right? Now note, the article is written around here. So after that, this is all projected. Okay, we don't actually have data for this. This is imagining the future. This is actual data. And the authors are comparing 2 countries, right? Nigeria and Indonesia. And they're comparing 2 different things among these countries. They're comparing GDP per person, so how much economic product is created within that country per every person, and what is the working age to non-working age ratio. So what are the number of people that are working compared to the number of people that are not working? If this were 1, that means that you have 1 person working for every person not working, right? And if this is greater than 1, right, then you have more people working for those not working, right? Okay, so, and then over here you have a ratio of working age to non-working age population, right? And then over here you have a GDP per capita. Okay, so in Nigeria, which is our quickly growing population, right? What we're seeing is that the working age to non-working age ratio is actually fairly low. Why is it low in a growing population? Because you have the babies that presumably are not working, and then you have the older population that's not working. And if the older population is living long enough, presumably for every person between 20 and let's say 20 and 65, you have just as many or more people that are either too young to work or too old to work, right? So that's that idea right there. Meanwhile, in Indonesia, where you're actually experiencing a population decline, what are you seeing? You're seeing that there is a period of time when there are more people working than not, right? And that's because they're not having babies. And so if there's fewer babies for the working age population, then there are presumably fewer expenses for that population, okay? And what is it that these authors supposedly saw during this time, they saw that in Indonesia, where you had this higher working age to non-working age population, you had this also growth in GDP per capita, okay? Which you would actually read this over on this y-axis, the GDP per capita axis. So their idea is they're calling this a demographic dividend, right? That there's a dividend that's being paid off by the fact that you're not having as many children. And that if you can capitalize on this and save it, then you might be able to support that working age population when they go into retirement. So the idea is that, in fact, rather than a decreasing population being a risk for an economy, it could actually be a good thing for that economy. Okay, so what would be a better answer to this question? A demographic dividend reflects the tendency of rapid economic growth to occur in conjunction with a rise in the proportion of a working age population. This is thought to be caused by the percentage of people entering the workforce and the reallocation of resources away from children. The article argues that countries can encourage demographic transition and will likely benefit from this dividend. Okay, so that would be a good answer. That would get you all your points. I'm not going to ask you this on a quiz because you could just copy it from here. Second question. The author indicates that aging populations are typically associated with some problems. What are these problems, and what does the author propose may be solutions to these problems? Well, we just talked through this, right? So if you look at this graph, this would be a declining population. This is pretty dramatic, where you have very few working age people to support a very large percent of the population that's not working age. And in this case, this could be an economic problem, right? These people aren't actually able to support themselves. They're not able to grow enough food, generate enough income. So the idea proposed by that dividend is hopefully they generated enough when they were working to be able to support themselves as they're aging. Okay, so that's the idea. That hopefully that walked you through some of the specifics of the paper. Remember that I'm going to post a question box, so go ahead and put any questions that you still have in that box so that I can answer them, or it'll be a forum rather, so that I can answer them for the entire class. Right.